Hi, hey everyone, I'm Aran Laing. I'm nothing special, just a hobbyist like the rest of you. I've just managed to figure out a few things in my yards over the last few years that are working, so I thought I'd share them with you. None of this is gospel or, the only way to do bees. Obviously, there's a million ways to skin a cat, but this is what I'm currently doing. And some little tweaks happen every year, but more or less, I'll give you the basics of what I do to get my bees through winter and through the season. So we'll go through this relatively quickly. If this will actually work. How do you make the click? There we go. So I've got 3 apiaries going. I have my home yard and a couple of out yards. In total, I have in any year about 35 to 45 production colonies and 20 to 26 overwintering nucleus colonies that come through in 4 over 4 over 4 double stacks. So a divided deep with then 4 frame supers above. I think I've been doing it about 8 years now. I'd have to look back, 7, 8, something like that. Another one of these funny little memes. Seems like what we're always doing at the moment, eh? Can everyone hear me okay, Bill? Is it clear enough?
Yeah, I hear you really good, really good.
So there's just real quick, there's a few things I love about beekeeping. I really enjoy raising queens and sort of tweaking my stock every year, trying to come up with better survival numbers. It's sort of a game, Raising bees is really exciting, and it's sort of how I load the deck for winter. And I'm going to use that phrase "load the deck" a lot of times in this talk, so I'll explain what it means as we go ahead. Obviously, we all love honey. I like the peace and quiet and that sort of calm and the smells and the sounds in the apiary. I really love that. Not so much when they get in my suit, but otherwise pretty comforting being out there with the sounds and the smells. I really like tinkering with my bees and coming up with new ways of doing things. Different overwintering configurations, different drone rearing from various hives, what time of the year I treat for mites and how I treat them. And obviously doing this is fun too, right? Meeting a whole bunch of other folk that do the same hobby. We're all a little bit nuts. It's kind of cool to meet a whole bunch of like-minded people. Things I don't like about beekeeping are probably about the same as what the rest of you don't like. Pests, super hot days, sweating away in a suit, unless your name's Bill Kaufman and you work your bees in your boxer shorts. The rest of us don't like doing that. So hot days, the bee suit's one thing I hate. I always seem to lose my hive tool. I don't know where it goes, some parallel universe, I think. And thistles, man, thistles are the bane of my existence. One of my yards has a lot of thistles. They go all over my suit and you're itchy the whole time you're there. Can't stand it. All right, onward. The home yard is the biggest yard I have typically. Always has 10 to 20 production colonies, and that's where all my overwintering nucleus colonies live. It's just easier for me that way. I keep planning on attempting comb honey in this yard, and I have all the equipment. I have had for a couple of years. I just sort of never get around to doing it because I got 1,000 other things going on in spring, trying to get these, queens raised and nukes made, and kids and grandkids and work and life and all that kind of good stuff. Hopefully this year I'll get it done. We'll see. The out yards, I have 2 of them. One of them's about 3 or 4 miles down the road at my friend Max's place. I think Max is on. G'day, Max. If you're there, I can't see you, mate. All I can see is my PowerPoint. Amazing honey out at Max's place. It's a 50-acre place, and there was a lot of loosestrife there last year, so we got really, really nice honey from there. Loosestrife honey is really nice. It's kind of a greenish color, very, very good honey. Another yard I have is at a friend's place about 20 minutes away from here. It's sort of up by Ray Lowe's house. It's a 300-acre certified organic farm up there, which is really nice. It's a good place to raise queens. There's no chemicals out there. That's loosestrife there. I actually thought about planting my whole back field in it after I tasted the honey. Turns out it's an invasive species, so don't do that. They don't like that, the Department of Conservation. You're not supposed to plant this, apparently, but if you've got it, it's bloody good honey. All right. Every year I say I'm not expanding. Every year somehow I expand. I'm sure everybody's aware of the same disease we all have called need another hive. So this year I'm going to add a yard with all singles. I'm going to come back to this concept later on. I like tinkering and experimenting. So I took 3 hives through winter this year as singles, and they all did fine. So I'm going to try and take a whole yard through and see if it's true, see if it's actually doable. Everyone keeps telling me it's not. And even though I say I won't expand, I've gone and bought another 10 resource hives. So that's 20 more nucleus colonies coming for next winter. It's a disease. Okay, something I'm really passionate about, guys. It's really important to get kids involved early in this. This is my son Elijah. This is last year when he was 10, with his first little hive, pretty decent brood pattern on his hive there. We can't expect the hobby or the profession of beekeeping to to last if all of us are in our 40s and 50s or older, right? It's just not going to last. We need young kids to get involved in this, become passionate about beekeeping. So with Elijah, it's sort of given us an opportunity to teach him about carpentry and painting and animal husbandry and nature, and then also about profit margins and expenditure and saving and tithing to the church and having to cover expenses for the hive and what you can expand next year. So all of this just from beekeeping can teach your kids a tremendous amount. So I think this is very important. This is a little wee man up the tree putting his swarm trap up on the left, looking at business with a smoker on the right there. It's him and me building some equipment, making some queen castles, him and I setting up some outyards there, him with his bees, Elijah learning to use the table saw on the right there. This is the little guy painting his own hives, releasing his own queen. And so again, I think it's important. If you've got kids, try and get them involved. They actually love it. I mean, they're a bit reluctant to do anything, these kids these days. Once they get in there, they enjoy it. So I love to raise queens. Why do I raise queens? Well, it's fun. That's the reason I do it. It's a hobby and I enjoy it. It's fun. Before I became a doc, I was a geneticist. My master's degree was in genetics before I went to medical school, and I'm just fascinated by it. And so, breeding and raising queens is a fun thing. It's a good way to try and tweak your stock and get the traits that you're looking for in your apiaries. It's a good way to load the deck. There's that saying again. We're going to keep coming back to that. It's also cheaper than buying queens, right? Queens are 40 or 50 bucks each, or crappy ones for 30 bucks. So, if you can raise them yourself, it's cheaper. It allows you to somewhat control the genetic pool, right? In order for that to happen, you have to have control of the drone pool as well, which for me means raising drones intentionally in the colonies where I want their genetics spread. Not just selecting the queen that I want, but selecting the hives that are going to produce the drones that I want to make with that queen. In order for a genetic program to work, you also have to be fairly ruthless in culling out the queens you don't want. You don't want crummy queens contributing their genetic material to your gene pool through drones. So why would anyone cull a queen? They're expensive, right? Well, if you're going to improve your stock, you have to do this. You have to look for what you're selecting for. Honey production, gentle bees, bees that aren't swarmy, bees that aren't running around all over the bloody combs while you're trying to work them. Aggressive bees get culled. I can't be bothered with that. It's a hobby for me. I don't like bees that come through winter with a tiny cluster or limp out of winter barely alive. I want to see plenty of resources left in the hive at the end of winter, so they're not just blasting through all the honey you give them and additionally needing more food. I mean, I'll come back to that. I do feed in winter, but that's insurance rather than necessity. So these are the sort of things you can see that I'm selecting for. Swarming behavior is a bit difficult. I'm pretty aggressive in swarm control. We'll come back to that also, but I don't want swarmy bees, but at the same time, if you're aggressive with your swarm control, it's not such a big thing. I also select for decent brood patterns, assuming that it's not hygienic behavior you're seeing. So if you're seeing a brood pattern with empty cells here and there, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a crummy queen. Forgive me if everybody knows this already. I'm just, I'm going to pretend people don't know. If you all know, then I apologize for saying obvious stuff. But if you've got spotty, patchy brood, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a crappy queen. You may have a queen that is raising hygienic bees, meaning that they are selecting diseased or mite-infected larvae and removing them and killing them. Real easy way you can test for that, get yourself some liquid nitrogen in a cup, tip it upside down on top of the brood frame, hold it there for 30 seconds, 20, 30 seconds, and then take it off. You've now effectively killed that circle of brood. Chuck the brood bag frame back in the hive and take a look at it a couple of days later and see how many of those brood cells they've emptied. A hygienic queen will empty all of them. You'll have a completely perfect circle where that cup of liquid nitrogen was, completely devoid of brood. That's not a bad queen, that's a hygienic queen. All right, so down the bottom again, I'm looking for these particular traits in my bees, and over winter, I want to see quiet clusters down the bottom of the hives. You're selecting for queens all year round, not just during honey production, not just during brood rearing. You're selecting your queens the whole year round if you're going to try and raise a better stock the following year. All right, so again, sort of the same thing. So I just somehow come up with exactly the same list on the next page. So enjoy exactly the same information a second time. Here's Elijah again. The reason to see these pictures is to look at the brood pattern. This is one of the queens that we grafted and raised. This is a first-year queen that Elijah had put into this hive as a released queen into a nucleus colony he raised. And you can see the brood pattern. That's what we're looking for. I want basically wall-to-wall brood if we can get it. This is how I raise queens. I'm just doing a sort of rapid run through my years, so I'm not doing a specific talk on rearing queens. I'm happy to do that if you guys want it, but we don't have time for that today. So I'm going to race through it. This is a queen rearing frame with plastic queen cups. This is a frame perch I bought from Ben and Kim out at Hungry Bear Farms. Just holds the frame in a good position. You can angle it so you can see into the cells. This is what accepted cells look like, and you can see a couple in there that haven't been accepted from the cell starter, where the bees have not built them out. And cells in various stages of development. The ones on the right are in the process of going out into nucleus colonies. All right, making up nucleus colonies. Nucleus colonies for me consist of a honey frame, pollen frame, 2 brood frames, 1 capped, 1 open, a current year's queen or a cell if I'm putting cells in there, a loaded 10-day-old queen cell. And then a frame of foundation or a half-built comb just for expansion. Sometimes, for whatever reason, you don't get a nuke into a big box fast as you want it to, and they'll swarm, or someone you sell the nuke to doesn't get it into a big box fast as they want to, and it'll swarm. So that expansion frame, I think, is useful. This is what a nuke looks like in my yard. I don't like skinny nukes. They don't do well. You want your nukes pouring out with bees, ideally. There are lots of ways to raise nukes. You can do spring nukes, which have to be much heavier in bees, right? More shakes of extra bees to keep them warm because it's colder at night. Summer nukes can be a little bit smaller, maybe 3 frames with a feeder. Queen castles are only 2 frames, right? And you don't need any brood in there whatsoever. And then mating nukes, again, you don't need any brood and mating nukes. But I use all of these, and it really sort of depends on what time of the year you're talking about and what the goals are for that queen and how much spare room you've got to put the nukes, right? I mean, I seem to always be running out of boxes and buying more. The one point I'd like to make is don't make your nukes too skinny. If you make them too skinny, you'll regret it. They don't make it. They limp their way through summer. They don't give you any honey production, and they roll into winter kind of crappy. You're far better off to make half the number of nukes and make them strong than make a whole mountain of crappy weak nukes. That's my opinion. That little hive you saw of Elijah's, that was a nucleus colony that in 1 year built up into 2 deeps and provided us a honey super, because it was a strong nuke when we started. All right, do I sell nukes? Yes, I do. Why do I sell nukes? Well, if you enjoy rearing queens, at some point you run out of room. I like to pull back my big colonies for swarm prevention and make splits and take brood from them to prevent them swarming. And in doing that, you end up with a lot of brood comb. I mean, we've got 60 or 70 colonies going and you're pulling a couple of brood combs more, and you've got to do something with them. And if you're not going to indefinitely expand, you have to sell those nukes to get rid of the extra frames. And then also I want to be able to continue my queen rearing without running out of room. I keep saying I'm not going to increase in production colonies, but somehow I keep doing that. It's a disease. And again, I really enjoy raising queens. It's probably my favorite part of the hobby. So I sell the overwintering nukes if I have more than I need, but I really take overwintering nukes through winter to replace dead outs, to provide brood for my cell starters and builders, and to boost my production colonies during the season. I really don't bring the overwintering nucleus colonies through to sell. I think out of 26 last year, I might have sold 4 or 5, and I think I've done the same this year. A little bit of a rant for a second. Everyone wants purebred bees. I'm a little baffled by this. I must every year get a bunch of phone calls and emails about, do I have purebred Italians or Carniolan's or Saskatraz or whatever? I don't, and I don't attempt to breed pure bees for a purpose. I want a hybrid of all of these bees in my yard and try and get as many good qualities from each genetic line as I can. Hopefully to come up with some sort of hybrid after successive years of breeding that has a superior net than any of the individual genetic lines alone. That's my goal. So I have a whole bunch of queens there. You can see there all kinds of them. Not really important for you to know where they're from, but they're all over the place. And I'm going to add some more this year as well. Every year I bring in about 3 or 4 queens. I think last year I grabbed some off Bill because he had some Michael Palmer queens. So I grabbed 3 or 4 of those. But just a little genetic diversity every now and then doesn't hurt. The benefits of selling nukes, obviously, swarm prevention. It allows you to cycle out brood frames so that you're not using the same brood frames in your production colonies year after year after year after year. And you're not giving old brood frames away in nukes either, because you're cycling these out every year. I mean, I'm going to show you some images in a minute of what Elijah and I have been doing over the winter months, but we've made up 500 or 600 frames already, and that's a pretty typical year. We go through that many. If you sell nukes, your queen program rocks on without any hindrance of space. Obviously, you get a little money to buy more toys for your bees, which is always fun. And if you have nukes in your yards all year long, you never have to buy bees again. You know, the internet's covered in people who keep saying, oh, I've lost my bees again, I'm gonna have to buy more nukes. I see a lot of these folks, you know. It's not necessary if you have spare nucleus colonies in your apiary. I really want people to think of bees not as the main asset in their apiary. They're not. The comb, in my opinion, is your biggest asset. You can make more bees, that's easy. You can even catch bees for free. But comb takes a ton of resource to make. And so in my opinion, the comb is the biggest resource you have, not the bees. I'm looking at this, but I realize the camera's over here. Maybe I'll move the camera there. Then I won't be looking off to the side the whole time. All right, so this is what the nucleus colonies look like when they leave my yard. So just the cardboard box taped down with a little plastic bung. The nuke pricing and why. There was a big discussion on Facebook this year about why nukes get more expensive every year. And I guess I've sort of thought about this myself. Why are nukes so bloody pricey? I mean, 170 bucks for bees seems kind of expensive, right? Well, I thought about this and I compared it to the price of packaged bees. And I think you'll find the breakdown of this fairly surprising. So packaged bees are basically a 3-pound pack of bees with a queen. You have no idea of the age of the bees. You don't know where they came from. You don't know how old their queen is, what the screening process was for the genetics for that queen, what her performance is, winter survivability, yada, yada, yada. You know nothing about these bees other than you've got a box of bees and a queen in a cage. For all you know, these bees could be old foragers bees and on the end of their lifespan already. No one really knows. The mated queen, you have no idea how long mated she was, where she's from, all that kind of carry on. And when I look at the different prices of packaged bees, you're somewhere between 120 and 200 bucks, depending on where you're buying them from. And that's just the bees, just a box of bees in a disposable crate that you throw away. Nucleus colonies, on the other hand, if you were to look at the consistency of, or the constituents rather, of a nucleus colony, you've got an 8-pound frame of honey in a deep hive. Well, 8 pounds at retail price is 56 bucks. Most commercial beekeepers will sell their brood frames for 30 bucks a shot. The pollen frame will just count, there's no pollen or comb on it, just count the frame and foundation alone, that's 3 bucks, and your partial comb is 3 bucks, and then your box is about $11.50. So the cost to the beekeeper to make this is about $130 for, without the bees we're talking about, just the frames and the comb and the box. So it's 130 bucks to make it, and you're selling the bees for 170 bucks, you're only making about $35 on the bees. And you're getting bees where you know where they came from, what the age is, brood that's related to the queen, a queen that's been selected for all these traits, yada, yada, yada. I'm not trying to sell nukes, don't worry about that. I'm just trying to make an explanation for why these things are so bloody expensive. If you compare the cost of the actual bees in a nucleus colony to the cost of the bees in a package, you're paying about 1/3 the price or 1/5 the price for the bees in a nucleus colony. All the rest of the stuff you get with it is just a bonus. All right, let's get off that and move on. How you install a nucleus colony, how I do it, I always try to maintain the integrity of the brood nest. So whatever frame order they're in, try and put that into your larger box in the same order so that you're not shifting frames around in orientation and whatnot. So the bees have an integrity to their brood nest. You go as slow as you need to. There's no need to race through this. I mean, it's a fun hobby. There's no prizes for getting done in 2 minutes. You're more likely to roll queens, particularly if you're a new beekeeper. It's very easy to angle a frame slightly as you bring it out and scrape the queen up against the next frame. So be really careful. If you can, it's not a biggie if you can't, but if you can identify your queen, that's fantastic. Put that frame somewhere safe. And then make sure when you finally put her into the nucleus colony that you've left a frame out. So there's plenty of space to get her in without squishing her. And keep your eye on the queen as much as you can when you're putting the frames in. So here's me putting a nucleus colony into a box for a customer. Friend of mine who was a little bit nervous about doing it himself, so I put this in the box for him. See a few things in this. Top left-hand corner, you see the paint can on the ground with the holes in the top. That's a gallon paint feeder. I always give nucleus colonies some pollen sub and some syrup to get going with. They don't have a large population, remember, so they don't have a huge foraging population. So, you can get them off to a good start on comb building and filling out that box of yours by giving them some syrup and pollen. And if you look at the bottom picture there on the right-hand side, the larger picture, down in that bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a spare super underneath the inner cover. In this picture here, you can see the nucleus colony is in the bottom super. You've got the inner cover on top of that. Underneath the inner cover is a pollen patty. And then on top of the whole of the inner cover is the paint can feeder. And then that spare super just goes around it to keep the rain off of it before you put the lid on. So that's basically how a nucleus colony gets chucked into a 10-frame box. Pretty straightforward. This is for you, Bill. Do you really need a protective gear and a smoker? Not if you're Bill Kaufman. You just get out there in your underpants and take the risk. Crazy bugger. I'm not brave enough for that. I hate getting stung. I'm like, I get plenty of stings already. I don't need any more, particularly on my legs. That video of you doing it last year in your shorts was disturbing, Bill. Disturbing for a number of reasons, disturbing. All right, on to the crux of the talk. If you forget everything else I've talked about, remember this one point. Your bees have mites. Every hive has mites. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Your bees have them. It doesn't matter if you don't see them. I hear this all the time. I don't see any bees. I don't see any mites on the bees. They're there. The vast majority of the mites are in the cells under the capping, or they live between the exoskeleton plates of the bees. I mean, the Google pictures you see, like this one here with the bee with the mite stuck on the side of it, I hardly ever see that. You almost never see that. You'll see mites when you do an alcohol wash. You'll see mites on the bottom board, but seeing it like this is very uncommon. So don't think for a second because you don't see mites, there's no mites. Your bees have mites, period. Okay, that's the only point I want everybody to remember. Whether you treat or not is up to you. Know that your bees have mites. All right, to treat or not to treat. I tried treatment-free the first couple of years. It sucked. I lost lots of bees and it wasn't fun for me anymore. It's a hobby. I didn't enjoy spring, cleaning out lots of dead beehives. Shaking out dead bees wasn't the fun thing I enjoyed. So I choose to treat for the reason of survival and for the enjoyment of it. And I just can't accept the high losses of treatment-free. I know people do, and all power to them. I've heard a lot of arguments as to why, if we don't treat, we're going to select for bees that are mite resistant. Nonsense. As a physician and a geneticist, I can tell you that is not true. Simple as that. Human beings are fairly evolved. We have yet to evolve any immunity to parasites or to insects. None. In all of human evolution, there has absolutely no resistance to insects nor parasites. I just don't see that happening anytime soon with bees. Even given their shorter lifespan, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Be that as it may, treatment or not is up to you. I'm just going to tell you how I do it. These are not wild bees. These are not native to North America. These are European honeybees. They're in a strange environment. They're not used to seeing mites. This is something that's only been affecting them for a few decades. And so as livestock, I think we need to care for them like livestock. I mean, no one would be silly enough to turn cows out in the wild and hope for them to survive. You know, I guess some of them may, right? But the vast majority of them would die. They're not wild animals. All right, and I think you see this in the feral population of bees, right? There's so few wild colonies now because of this reason. All right, to test or not to test for mites, I don't bother. If you accept the fact that mites are ubiquitous, that your bees have mites, then I don't see the benefit of waiting for them to get to a certain threshold before I treat them. If I know my bees have mites, and I know mites transmit viruses, I know the viruses are bad for my bees, I choose to treat them. So I don't very often do a test. If I do a test, it's with isopropyl alcohol, but it's, you know, the only times I would probably do that is if I'm teaching somebody, to be honest with you. I just go ahead and treat. I treat all my hives 4 times a year. I rotate between treatments. So they get oxalic acid in March. I'm just finishing up all of the bees' treatments for oxalic acid now, actually. They get formic acid in June. They get apivar right after I pull the honey in August, and they get a final dose of oxalic acid in December when they're broodless, or when they're virtually broodless. All right, anytime you get a chance to look inside drone brood, every time you pull a frame up and some drone brood gets torn open, take a good look at it. The mites love getting in the drone brood. They're not exclusively in the drone brood, but they certainly like going in there. So take a look when you can. The timing of treatment is really important. And again, this is a big focus of the way I keep bees. The timing of mite treatments to make sure you have healthy winter bees. We're going to come into that in some detail shortly. Treating bees isn't cheap, and I can get that. I mean, Formic Pro and apivar are not cheap products. Oxalic acid's cheap, right? But the actual gadget you use to vaporize them is not. You can pay a few $100 for one of those. But if you break it down, let's say you didn't want to invest in a vaporizer for oxalic acid and you just wanted to use Formic Pro and Apivar, just 2 treatments a year, which is better than nothing, seriously better than nothing. You're looking at about $8 a year per hive. Even if you doubled that, even the prices went up and it was double that price, $16 a hive per year is a hell of a lot cheaper than $170 for a new nucleus colony. And the disappointment and the misery in a hobby of losing your bees, it's just not fun. Forget the cost of it. I think there's a number of reasons that people don't treat bees. I think, and the arguments are valid. People don't want chemicals in their hive. I understand that. But pesticides, so that one's no good. But it's effective. So as long as you're doing brood frame rotation on a regular basis, can you still hear me? My internet connection is unstable, it says, whatever the heck that means. You can still hear me okay?
We missed.
Yeah, you're good.
We
You
missed.
cut out for a second.
Yeah, about 3 minutes.
If I'm boring you to tears, let me know and I'll shut up and just scroll through the photos. So I think the reason people don't treat is the chemical issue. I think that people are worried about the cost of treatment, which is, we've seen, it's relatively cheap. And I think also, and this is sad but true, the attrition rate for new beekeepers is really high. It's about 80+%, people who do it for a year and give up. And they give up because their bees die. I think in a large number of these cases, they have this perception that you can stick a box of bees in your back lawn and they'll make your garden look pretty and that's all you need to do. And at the end of the year, you get some honey. This is far from the truth with beekeeping. As you all know, it's a lot of work. All right, so down to, in my opinion, the most critical part of mite management, when you treat them. It's all geared to healthy winter bees, right? This is going to be a little in depth, so stick with me. Winter bees are not the same as summer bees. They have a dramatically longer lifespan. You know, they have morphological differences. They have larger hypopharyngeal glands. They make a lot more vitellogenin, which is this chemical that they form, which allows them to produce brood food even when they're not eating pollen. So that's kind of useful over the winter months when their pollen and you know, bee bread may run out, they can still raise brood. Keeping in mind your queen is going to be raising small amounts of brood throughout the winter and then really cranking that up in the spring. The winter bees have much larger fat bodies than the summer bees do, and a higher concentration of vitellogenin, like I was talking about. And it's actually proposed that that may be the reason they live so long, the vitellogenin concentration. Let's move forward. What makes your bees raise winter bees? It's the decline in pollen coming in, as it turns out. I don't know if it's just quantitative or qualitative or both, but as the pollen comes down, the bees start to raise winter bees. This may actually be a point where we can manipulate our bees' behavior with frozen pollen or with pollen sub. I'll have a crack at monkeying around with that and see what we get this year. Experimenting is always fun. All right, again, keep in mind your queen's wearing brood rearing throughout the winter. We like to think that they're broodless for months on end. I haven't found that to be true. I think if you go through dead outs at any stage in winter, you'll find tiny little patches of brood among the dead bees. I think she's probably raising small amounts of brood relatively early in the winter and right the way through. But certainly she ramps up the brood production in spring. Trouble is there might not be much pollen left in the hive by that time, which means your winter bees need to have fat bodies left over and plenty of vitellogenin left over so that they're able to raise brood food without the pollen. Problem is, what do mites do to bees? You know, mites parasitize the fat body of the bee. So if your winter bees have less fat body and run out of juice by the time spring brood rearing really cranks up, if their fat body's depleted and they don't make as much vitellogenin anymore, eventually your colony is going to die off. And I think that's why we keep hearing about colonies that were looking great in February suddenly dying out in March. I mean, if you look at any of the beekeeping forums right now, this is going on. Another reason I just treat and feed pollen all the way through. I know we're going to talk about conventional wisdom for a second. Everybody has this idea, and I like to call this bro science. And I guess, you know, a lot of what I do is bro science too. Bro science to me is someone says something, so it must be true. There's no evidence to back it. There's absolutely no data to back it, but someone says it, so it must be true. And this idea that you mustn't give pollen to bees in early spring because they'll build up too quick. And then what they'll do is protect that brood and they won't cluster on cold nights. And so the colony will die out protecting the brood. I'm going to gently say that's nonsense because I feed pollen starting in early March. March 1st, actually, every single one of my colonies gets pollen. I've never seen any of them die out from cold, from protecting brood and not clustering. I just think that's fiction. And it's not physiologic. If you think about the fact there's been no fresh pollen coming into that hive for several months, your bees are raising brood solely on the backs of those winter bees and their fat bodies and the vitellogenin that they have. And that might parasitize that ability. If you're not providing pollen and feed, I think you're asking for your colonies to die. I think you're asking for your colonies to run out of juice before the fresh pollen starts coming in from the trees. My winter survival is pretty good. I got no complaints. I got 61 or 63 going this year. You know, me and Bill were talking about this the other day, and something Bill said really struck me. He said, oh yes, the yardstick by which all beekeepers are measured, winter survival. It got me thinking. It's really a stupid thing to measure someone's skill by. Bill and me are polar opposites, right? Bill is treatment free, and I treat 4 times a year. You can't compare our winter survivals. It has nothing to do with skill as a beekeeper. It's a choice of how you keep bees. Nothing more, nothing less. It's a choice, right? If you choose to be treatment free, you're accepting higher losses. Doesn't mean you're a less apt or skilled beekeeper. Keep in mind also that I load the deck, right? I aggressively cull out any queen that is even slightly marginal in the fall. If I don't think she's up to snuff, I squish her and I combine those colonies. Let's say I didn't do that and I took all the crappy queens that were limping along through summer, crappy production, spotty. Let's say I kept those crappy queens and took them through winter. Well, half of them would die. And then all of a sudden my winter survival would look terrible. And you guys will all think my skills as a beekeeper were worse. So, you know, this is not a competition. You're not trying to beat Bill Kaufman's winter survival. You're not trying to beat Aran's winter survival. It's not about that. This is a hobby. If someone figures something out, instead of dogmatically sticking to the party line that, oh, I heard this guy say that won't work, give it a try. What have you got to lose? It's not scientific randomized controlled trials, but if someone's saying something's working, it makes no sense to me to poo-poo that without giving it a try myself. You know, that's my 2 cents on it. All right, let's move on. Singles. Every year I hear people tell me you can't bring singles through winter in upstate New York. They won't survive. By singles, I mean a single deep frame box, 8 frame, 10 frame, whatever. So I tried to try it this year with 3 colonies. They all made it through the winter. They did have quilt boxes, which is a moisture control, and they had shims, feeding shims, like a 1-inch rim of wood that I put the feeding patties into. And they all came through winter fine. My buddy Doug, I don't know if you're on here, Doug. If you are, g'day, mate. I can't see you because I can just see my PowerPoint. But Doug put a nuke into a 10-frame box with a screen bottom board with no shim and no quilt box, nothing. And that colony's rocking along with a screen bottom board and a single. So it can definitely be done. I'm going to try it in a whole yard this year and see what numbers we get. It may just be a fluke that these ones made it, but I'm going to give it a try with a bigger number of hives. Okay. Sorry about my rant about the beekeeping skills. Back to the mites. So we're back to this idea. Mites transmit viruses, right? K-wing virus, paralytic bee virus, among others that are not good for our bees. But more importantly, again, they're feeding on the bees' fat bodies. I think this is a really critical point. By feeding on the fat bodies, you have less stored energy, hence less vitellogenin, hence less ability to raise brood food in the absence of pollen, hence a shorter lifespan of your winter bees, which means you get smaller clusters as you go through winter, and eventually that cluster will no longer be able to maintain heat. And you'll have a dead cluster of bees on a frame while there's mountains of honey all around them. Does that sound familiar to all you guys? Because that seems what I'm hearing described on the Facebook forums repeatedly. People say, I don't get it. It can't be starvation. There's honey everywhere. It's mites. It's mites depleting your winter bees down to the point where they can't maintain heat eventually, and they can't raise brood enough because there's no fat bodies left. And, you know, that's my opinion of why they die off this time of the year. All right. So with that in mind, all of my treatments are geared toward healthy winter bees. In fact, the whole season is geared toward healthy winter bees. keep in mind, if you guys haven't looked at scientific beekeeping with Randy, you should. He's got this really cool graph which shows the peak in bee population that goes like this, and then the peak in mite population that goes like this. So as your bees are declining late summer, the mite population is increasing, and then it also declines later. You've got to have those mites under control before the pollen stops coming in or starts to decline, because that's the trigger for raising winter bees. And in order to have healthy winter bees, you need low mite populations, right? So it's not enough to say, well, you know, I treated my bees in September. You missed the boat. You needed to treat them in August, early August, so that they're able to raise healthy winter bees when the pollen starts declining. And again, it's sort of back to the same thing. What mystery killed my beehive? It's no mystery. In my opinion, the vast majority of the time, bees are dying because the fat bodies are parasitized by mites. They run out of their intra-abdominal stores by March. They can't raise big enough clusters. They lose temperature regulation, and the bees die in the face of plenty of resource. So it's why I treat my bees regularly. March and Christmas for oxalic acid, formic acid in June, and then apivar right after the honey's pulled. And again, I used to try treatment free. I just couldn't handle the losses. The losses were crazy. Now I'm really surprised when I go out the yard and find a dead colony. I'm like, well, that's a bit of a kick. I expect all the colonies to come through, or certainly the vast majority of them. I think in the last 3 or 4 seasons, I've lost 4 colonies total now over 4 years, I think. Yeah, something like that. All right, back to loading the deck. So don't forget, I'm selecting for cold hardy bees. I'm selecting for bees that winter frugally, that have plenty of food left over. I aggressively cull out queens that don't make the grade. Keep in mind, in my opinion, bees are not the biggest asset in your apiary. The comb is. I stay on top of my mites with regular rotating treatments, and I give supplemental feed throughout the winter and the spring months. And in the fall as well, certainly you'll see my fall regimen in just a minute. Here are my keys to winter survival. Young queens, don't get hooked on the queen. Don't name your queens. That's a terrible idea. Don't get emotionally attached to queens. When they get less productive, squash them. Give them a new queen. Get rid of that queen. Give the hive a new queen, a fighting chance to get through winter. Old queens will eventually crap the bed. It's not worth keeping them on year after year after year after year. Although last year I had a couple of 2017 queens that were finally superseded. Otherwise, I was going to have to kill them. All right, the next thing I think is important is northern genetics. I know not everybody agrees with this idea, but I do. I think you can certainly cause selective breeding in animals by selecting for various traits. And it's not to say that you couldn't have a bee from Florida survive in upstate New York. I just don't think it would be as suited to this place as an animal or an insect that's been line bred for this condition. Much the same way that an Eskimo probably does better in the snow than a Fijian does. Not that the Fijian couldn't survive, I just think he could do as good as the Eskimo does. Mite control is obviously very important. Moisture control, mouse control, keeping the mouse guards on, and then leaving them plenty of food. Don't be cheap with the honey. Don't take every last little scrap they've got. The big question, do you wrap your hives or not? I have tried it all, man. I've tried insulation and tar paper without insulation without tar paper. I've tried it all. No wrapping. So here's a few pictures of various configurations I've tried. Oh, actually, I guess it's just one picture. I thought I had more. But this is just tar paper with foam insulation in between the hives. I've seen absolutely no difference. I mean, my son was injured a couple of years ago very badly, unfortunately, in a fall. And that fall, I didn't get time to do a lot of the winter prep that I should have done in terms of wrapping and moisture control and all the rest of it. All the bees survived. Every colony came through that winter without dying. So I think we all get too hung up on this idea. There is absolutely no R value in tar paper. R value meaning insulation. There's no R value to it whatsoever. It probably provides somewhat of a windbreak. There's probably some minor solar gain in the summer when the sun hits it. But really, if you don't wrap, I don't see any bloody difference, to be honest. I have seen a difference in the really small colonies, the Nucleus Colonies. Again, I haven't seen them die from not being wrapped, but I see them struggle through winter and use a lot more resource and come sort of limping out the other side. So I tend to wrap the smaller colonies and I chuck foam insulation under the outer cover. I really do that to prevent liquid dripping back down on top of the bees. Keep in mind, hot air rise is going to hit that cold outer cover, condense, and then drip back on your bees, and moisture definitely kills bees. My favorite hive arrangement. I don't know that there is a an optimal winter arrangement, I've tried loads of different things: singles, doubles, triples with supers, doubles with supers, doubles without, Nucleus colonies. This year I tried some singles. I haven't seen a big difference, to be honest. I don't think there is one perfect way to winter bees. I think if you have a cavity matched to the size of your cluster and the resources matched to the size of that cluster, I think your bees will do okay. As long as everything else is equal, right? Mite treatments, moisture control, all the rest of it. So my preferred winter arrangement, which really makes nucleus colony raising a little bit easier in the spring, is to have everybody in double deeps. That way I can just take deep frames out of the top box where the bees are. It's a lot easier than having supers on top, which I find to be bloody irritating. You have to then rotate and get the supers out and put excluders on and all the rest of it to get the bees out of your supers, which is a bit of a nuisance. So here's my preferred wintering arrangement. Bottom board, 2 double deeps. On top of that, I don't use inner covers in winter. So on top of the second box of frames goes a 1-2 inch feeding shim. It's just a piece of junk wood that I make into a rim. It has ventilation holes in it. On top of that goes a quilt box, which again is just a rim of junk wood with some window screen under it. And I fill that up with, wood shavings or leaves or newspaper or whatever you've got that'll absorb liquid. And on top of that goes your foam and then the outer cover on top of that. And I ratchet strap it down and put a cinder block on top because hives blow over. The cinder block makes that a little bit less likely, but if they do blow over, the ratchet strap stops the boxes from separating, which makes it a bit easier for the bees to survive if that tip over happens. So here are feeding shims. This is just, this is what happens to the top of your chest freezer if you use it as a workbench. It all gets beat up like that, but that's okay. It's just a garage work freezer. So these are feeding shims I build. The one on the left is for a regular hive. The one on the right is for a double overwintering nucleus arrangement where a divided deep has 4 frames on each side. All right, this is a quilt box. Again, it's just junk wood with some window shield over it, window screen. You fill that up with wood shavings or whatever, and it absorbs water. All right, so on the left there, you can see another one of my arrangements where I wrapped all the hives in insulation. What a giant pain in the ass that was. That took a long time to do. And then you've got to store all that insulation. And again, I saw no difference in the survival compared to not doing it. You can see on the right, I've tried with just wrapping and nothing else. So this is a couple of my different yards. The bottom line in wrapping is I don't think it makes any difference at all. Wrap if you want to, if you've got time. I tend to do it to the smaller colonies, otherwise I don't bother. If I've got time, I do it to all of them. I don't get too hung up on it if I don't. All right, that little one on the left is just a cute picture I stole off the internet. The one on the right is a picture with a thermal camera of one of my colonies in the dead of winter. And what's neat about this is you can see the colony is not wrapped because your thermal camera won't go through the tar paper very well. More importantly, you can see the cluster very tightly balled up in that bottom box, which means I know I don't need to open this. I know they have food above them. If they didn't, they'd be in the top box. So they're doing fine. I bring nukes through winter. I do this in a 4/4/4 arrangement. So, you've got a deep 10 frame box with a divider down the center, 4 frames on each side, and then 4 frame supers on top. And I go up 2 more levels. So there's 12 frames total in those nucleus colonies. I think they come through winter actually better than the big girls do. And again, I think it comes back to if you have a cluster matched to the cavity, I think you're good. I don't think you need to have a certain number of bees or a certain number of boxes to get through winter. Just match the cluster to the box. I use these nucleus colonies all the way through the summer. I steal frames of brood out of them to make up cell starters and cell builders. I steal frames out to make nucleus colonies. I steal frames of brood out to boost my production colonies. They are just a fantastic resource to have in your apiary. And late in the fall, if you've got a hive that you're thinking, wow, this queen's kind of a little old and I really should squish her and replace her, not only do you replace her, you put that whole overwintering nucleus colony that you've got in your apiary straight into that box, and that production colony has all of a sudden got a young queen leading into winter, and it's got a dramatically higher amount of resource, a lot more honey, a lot more bees. So yeah, that's all I want to say about that. What am I looking for in my bees in winter? Because remember, you're selecting queens all the way through. If you're raising queens, you're not just selecting for them during the season, you're selecting all year. So I want to see really tightly balled, very quiet bees in the bottom of the box. I know everybody says, well, go up and see if you can hear them humming. I'm happiest if I can hear nothing. I want the bees quiet. The less they move around, the less they use. I want to see that the top entrance is properlized down a little bit to decrease draft. And I want to see that they're in that bottom box well into late January, that they haven't moved up, that they're not consuming all the resources in that hive yet. I just went through a nucleus colony this afternoon. The one dead out I had was a nucleus colony, and its partner in the double overwintering setup was still in the bottom box with 8 frames of honey above it. So they have literally stayed in that bottom box the entire winter. Crazy. All right, so these are some endoscope photos that I took of my bees this year. This is early March. I'm looking in through the bottom entrance here, and you can see the bees very tightly clustered on the bottom frames, the bottom of the frames, the bottom box. Same here. Excuse the dead bee that's right in front of the camera on the right-hand side there. If you look to the left, you'll see the cluster hanging off the bottoms of the frames. Again, I'm looking through the bottom entrance of the hive. Same here again, dead bees on the bottom, looking in through the bottom entrance, and you see the bees nicely clustered, very quiet. No one's panicking, running around right at the bottom of those frames. This is what I don't want to see. This is a colony whose queen I will not be using to rear other queens from this year. She'll be getting replaced. Even though she's made it through winter, this is in the top box. You can see you're not seeing the bottom board. You're not seeing the bottoms of the frames. I had to look at this colony through the upper entrance with the endoscope, and these bees are already out of food. You can see that that comb's dry. So this is a colony that, although it survived winter, required supplemental feeding. And so that's not a colony I want to propagate, right? That's not a trait that I want to see followed through in my apiary. So that's not a queen that'll get breed from. She'll be replaced this year. Do I feed over winter? Yes. Again, this conventional theory that if you open a beehive in 30 degrees, the colony somehow mystically dies. It's just pure nonsense, absolute nonsense. I am opening my bees every other week from the beginning of January through. Any colony that I see in the top box with the thermal camera gets fed. There's no point letting them die. I mean, I'm not going to breed that queen, but the whole colony doesn't have to go, right? You pop the top cover up where you've got your feeding shim, and then you've got the quilt box above it. You get your tool, you pry the quilt box up, you lift it up about 2 inches, you slide a patty in, you close it again. Takes about 10 seconds a hive. The bees do fine. Trust me, they don't die. Starvation, on the other hand, that'll kill your bees. This is what I use for winter feed. This is not an advertisement for Man Lake. It's just that somehow the photo took the front of it like that. Anyway, I buy these big pails. You can make your own winter feed, I think. It's just, you know, my wife is very tolerant of the gigundal mess I make with bees. Our garage is literally packed top to bottom. You will see some photos in a minute. It's not good. She's already pretty tolerant. If I started making bee food in the kitchen, I'm pretty sure I would die from that. So this is a product I buy, 50-pound tubs. I buy 4 or 5 of them a winter. And you just scoop it out in some parchment paper. You roll it out with your wife's rolling pin and don't tell her. And then you get this, which is basically 2-pound patties. And then this is in winter. So obviously opening the cluster doesn't kill them, right? But you see these bees are in the top. At the top of this picture, you can see the mesh, which is the underside of the quilt box. You can see the wood shavings inside there. And the bees are in the top box, meaning they're out of food, and they are eating the winter patty that you can see in the bottom of the frame there. All right, we're into spring, and I've got about 12 minutes left. So I think I'm going to have this done within the hour, and then we can get on to whatever questions people have. So in spring, I'm making, repairing, and painting equipment, getting my treatments from oxalic acid going. I've got 2 treatments left on 1 yard. Otherwise, my bees are all treated for spring already, which is great news. And you're feeding again. Your bees can starve out in March. So get some feed on them. It's cheap insurance. If they don't eat it, you're out of pocket a couple of bucks for sugar or a pollen patty. If they do eat it and you didn't give it to them and they were hungry, you just lost a $170 colony, you know, which makes no sense. And you also lost the genetic material in that colony, although realistically, you're probably not going to want to breed from a queen that's totally out of food by that point. So pollen patties go on 1st of March for all my colonies. I want rapid spring buildup. I make nucleus colonies. I disagree this causes problems for the bees and promotes swarming or chill brood. My opinion, no fact to base it, just my own colony survivals. All right, so this is what me and Elijah are doing in spring, my little worker helper, my little bud, my boy. So we're making frames. And like I say, we've made 500 or 600 already. We have 2 more boxes to do in the shed yet. This is a little jig I made. It's cheap junk that I made. Again, you can see my poor garage work freezer. It's a bit beat from me using it as a work table. Here's Elijah quickly putting together frames with his winter jacket on because it's bloody freezing outside. And this is what we've been doing over the winter. I told you my wife was tolerant. That's her car somewhere stuck in the back of all that big mess. It's a 3-car garage, and hers is the only one you can get a car in. You can't at the moment. There's more bee stuff in there now. Anyway, moving on. Here's me and Elijah doing some more building of gear. And early spring, this is last year actually. So these are some boxes I painted in the middle and my wife's fairly meager artwork on the outside. You can clearly see who the better artist is there. I think my boxes, you'll have to agree, look dramatically better than hers. April, I'm assessing colony strength, and I equalize in late April. People wonder, why bother equalizing? Don't you want to weed out the weak queens? Well, I mean, it's not always the queen's fault that you've got a small cluster in spring. It may be ineffectual mite treatments. It may be that box had a leak. It may be they didn't have enough resource. There's a number of reasons your bees may not be looking epic by the time April rolls around. But in order to make a decision on whether that queen gets culled or not, she has to start from an equal starting point with the rest. So I equalize the hives for two reasons. One, to make sure I can weed out the dud queens, because if they're all the same strength and then one of them trickles along behind the other, I know this is a dud and I kill her. The other reason to do it is for swarm prevention. If you pull back the strong colonies and boost the smaller ones at the beginning, you're doing effective swarm treatment, the swarm prevention right off the bat. And also in April, I'm starting to set up my cell builders and my cell starters. There's two methods I use. I use a 5-frame cell starter, and then I use the Michael Palmer 10/10 technique. And again, this isn't a talk on queen rearing. I'm happy to do that if you guys want to talk on queen rearing, but I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail today. There again is why I equalize what I just told you, just to select for the good and crappy queens and also for swarm prevention. Queen rearing essentially, in a nutshell, is taking advantage of the emergency response that bees follow when they're queenless and the swarming response that bees do when they're overpopulated, when there's no longer enough room for the queen to lay, and when there's an abundance of resource coming in and they are backfilling the brood nest. Those are the two big triggers for queen rearing. You know, the supersedure response is there as well, but you're not going to make a lot of queens by going around and injuring your queen and hope that they supersede her. You know what I mean? I'm trying to raise 50 or 60 queens at a time, and the supersedure method is just not feasible for large volume queen rearing, really. So the basic way you do this is you make an unnaturally strong hive, so overpopulated. You feed them with 2-to-1 syrup and pollen patties, too much resource coming in. You limit the queen's ability to lay because they're backfilling her brood nest, and then you suddenly make them queenless. And when you do that, these bees will jump on a frame of grafted larvae and raise all of them as queens. This is a 5-frame starter that I use. Again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. We don't have a lot of time for that. This is basically how it works, though. You're basically going to put 4 frames of food and 1 frame of capped brood into that. And then you're going to shake bees from about 10 to 15 frames in there. Just make sure you don't shake a queen in there. That would be a disaster. But you're basically looking to shake about 10 to 15 frames of nurse bees into that tiny little 5-frame box. They've got 4 frames of food and 1 frame of capped brood to keep them there. That's day 1. Later on day 1, you do your graft and you go and replace that brood frame in the middle of all those nurse bees with your graft. You then pull the brood out and you go and give that to another hive. So now what you've got in that 5-frame box is 15 frames worth of nurse bees that have already been fed syrup for the last week. So they're loaded up to make royal jelly, and they are queenless, and they are overpopulated, and they have nothing but an abundance of food. And so you have triggered the swarming response and the emergency response. They'll jump on your grafts and they'll raise all of them. All right, so you really want those cell builders or those cell starters just boiling over with bees where you can barely get the lid on. And there it goes. This is what I just described. 24 hours after it's been in the cell starter, you can pull it out. You can see very clearly which cells have been accepted and which haven't. They're slightly built out around the edges. You can see a nice puddle of royal jelly in the bottom of the larvae in it. And you then put that into a cell builder, which is a really strong colony with about 7 or 8 frames of brood above a queen excluder. Someone is texting me. It's Max. Wow, you are a useless speaker. I didn't no idea you knew so little about beekeeping. Thanks, Max. All right, that's not what it says, I paraphrased. So this is sort of how I raised the queens. Last week of April, first week of May is grafting. Last week of April is a bit risky. You know, I'm going to get onto this, but every year people call me and they're like, when are you going to have nukes ready? I want them as early as possible. You know, we have a theory that the later queens are probably better. What does it take to get a mated queen? Obviously, you've got to select a good queen stock. You've got to graft appropriately. You've got to have a strong starter and a strong finisher. But there's no point having a beautiful charged, big fat queen cell, and then you've got sparsely populated drone congregation areas. You need to have a decent drone population, and not just any drones, right? We're trying to load the deck here. You don't want some, just any population of crappy drones mating with your new queens you spend all this time making. So you also want to intentionally raise drones in the colonies that have shown you that they have the traits you're looking for. So not just a queen that's grafted for desirable traits, but drones as well. And that's pretty simple. You just put a drone frame. Well, if you get a foundation frame and you chop a chunk of it out, so you leave a strip of worker foundation down the middle and two open sources in the middle, and you stuck that in a brood nest, production frames build drone comb. Simple as that. They don't build worker comb in the space, they build drone comb. And so you select the colonies that are of desirable traits and you raise drones. But you can have a far bigger population of drones by the time June rolls around than you will in early May. But people want early nukes. You see what I'm saying? It's sort of a paradox rather, of trying to balance when people want their nucleus colonies with how good a quality product you can provide them. All right, let's keep moving on. So 9 days after the graft, you need to make up your nukes because you want them queenless for about 24 hours, or so at least I make them queenless for about 24 hours before I put the queen cells in. And having 3 yards is kind of handy. Max, if you're listening to this, this is going to be happening at your place this year, mate. Sorry, I should have told you. We're moving nucleus colonies from 1 yard to the other, just so the bees don't reorient back from where you made the split. And then you chuck the cell in there. Thumbs up from Max. You chuck the cells in there on day 10. You got to be real careful with them. They're going to hatch in a couple of days. You don't want to bump them around or get them cold or whatever. So these are, this frame has hardly any cells on it because these are cells that are going into nucleus colonies, and that frame is sitting on top of a colony while I pick the cells off and put them in nukes. I don't bother with queen cell protectors. And again, I can do another talk on cell rearing if that's what you want. You can't just focus on raising queens and nukes in May. It's a very busy time of the year. The bees are building up rapidly. You've got mite control to do. You've got swarm control to do. You've got to stay ahead of them on the supers because there's honey coming in and you don't want to miss it. If you get a chance, read on BeeSource, which is a beekeeping forum, about opening up the brood nest. It's kind of a long discussion, but essentially it involves taking the frames from the side of the brood nest and putting either partial foundation or partial comb in there. And the bees don't like that. And then you move the brood up into a checkerboarded pattern in a box above. You can read all about opening up the brood nest. It is an extremely effective way of swarm control. And you get a ton of new comb built, which is kind of nice too. All your swarm traps want to be up by the end of April, early May. Here's Wee Man up a tree. Oh, he doesn't like being called Wee Man anymore. He's Elijah. He was Wee Man when he was little. He doesn't like it anymore. So this is Wee Man up a tree with his swarm trap. You can see there's no leaves on that tree. So this is cold. This is early April, mid-April. Here we are, success. Elijah's got a little swarm trap. This is over at Max's place, my buddy Max around the corner, where one of my yards is. Max is actually going to be doing Slovenian beekeeping this year. He's going to be getting a whole bunch of AZ hives going, so we'll all be able to learn from him at some point. Anyway, this is a nucleus colony or a swarm colony rather, that Elijah caught going into his little swarm box there. Sadly, as it turned out, this queen was no good, so I ended up squishing her and replacing her with one of the Michael Palmer queens I stole from Bill. All right, around mid-May, my second graft goes, and the second grafting is the one that I'm going to keep. And I try and explain this to people when they're buying nucleus colonies, that I believe that you get a better mating percentage and possibly a better mating quality with a later queen. The warmer it gets, the larger the drone congregation area population is going to be, and the better the chance of that queen being adequately mated. Keep in mind, she's only going to mate once in her life and then lay eggs for the next X number of years. I mean, they're an incredible creature, but you want to, again, load the deck, make it as optimal as you can. So the second graft in mid-May, those nukes are ready for me by mid-June. And I usually use the Michael Palmer 10/10 method for doing the second round of queens because you have a lot more brood frames available to you then. And I'll go into that on a different talk. But suffice to say, I'm aiming for the biggest, chunkiest queens I get with that second graft because they're going to populate my overwintering nukes. All right, make sure you're staying ahead of the bees with your supering. Otherwise, you'll regret it. You'll have swarms, your bees will be in the trees, you lose your honey crop. Mid-June, I'm looking for a 2-week period where the temperatures don't exceed 84 degrees. As soon as I see that on the weather forecast, I get Formic Pro on everybody. And I've had no queen loss, zero with Formic Pro. I didn't have any queen loss with Might Away quick strips either. I find them to be very effective. They bloody stink. You don't want to breathe that in. Very effective. I just make sure you're sticking within the temperature time zone. You know, you can either do one strip every 10 days for 2 treatments, or you can do 2 strips for a 14-day single treatment. And very effective at mind control. All right, continuing on to June, I'm setting up my double overwintering nukes with that second round of cells that I grafted. Again, I usually use the Michael Palmer 10/10 method for that. We'll talk about that in a different talk, I suppose. It's such a long discussion to explain that. I think it's probably best for another time. These nukes all start out as 4-frame totals. Remember, they start off in a divided deep, 4 frames on each side of a divider. And in that 4 frames, one of those frames is foundation. So they basically get a feed frame, a cap frame, an open brood frame, and a foundation frame. And that makes up their colony. And from mid-June, when those nukes go in there, until winter, they'll build into 12 full frames. And each stack will typically give me a full box of honey. So build out an entire medium of comb and fill it with honey, those 2 little colonies, above a queen excluder. They work quite comfortably through the queen excluder. They don't fight. They don't try and kill each other. And I still brood off these colonies all the way through the year. If I've got a colony that I don't think is up to snuff, I'll see how she does with an extra brood frame, and if not, she gets squished and replaced. All right, rocking along. We're into July. Swarm management, man, super important. Make sure your bees stay in their boxes. Excuse me for just a second, I closed the door. Sorry about that. I think one of the dogs opened the door and it was getting a bit noisy. So super management, keep ahead of the bees. Don't be shy. This idea that you have to wait till a super is 90% full before you put another one on. I don't do that. I chuck 2 or 3 of them on at a time. You know, and then I will chuck the empty super under the full one. You know, so you've got your brood chambers and then your queen excluder. If you use them, I do. Not everybody does, but I use a queen excluder. And then above that, your supers. If this one's full, I move it up and put the empty one right on top of the queen excluder. I find they build it out a little bit quicker like that. Watch out for robbing. Again, we're selecting queens, right? And while we want to cull the crappy queens, you can't always just say, oh, this queen sucks, I'm going to kill her. There may be reasons that colony is struggling. And if you've got a particularly strong colony, maybe next to a nucleus colony or maybe next to a swarm that you've captured and they're struggling, it may be robbing. So keep a good lookout for that. It's pretty easy to recognize. Again, I won't talk a lot about it because, you know, it's going to take time. Just look on YouTube what robbing looks like. Make sure you have some robbing screens on hand. And if that doesn't do the trick, you might even want to pick that colony up and move it somewhere else. August, pull the honey. Get your apivar strips on. That's what I do. As soon as that honey comes off, the next day apivar strips go on the bees. If you've still got honey supers on there, you have to do something else. You could use another round of formic acid, formic pro strips, or you could take the supers off and use oxalic acid vapor and then put them back on again. Extraction time. I love it. It's so much fun. Max's boys helped me out this year. It's fantastic. It's a lot of work, obviously, when you've got a lot of boxes to do. Me and the lads got stuck into it in the garage. This year we've got a barn being built, so I'll have a little more room to do the extraction, thankfully. And I bought some more extracting equipment too, which is quite cool. That's the fun of the hobby, isn't it? Getting all the toys. You don't need them, but it's fun. All right. It's not just about the honey, although the honey is pretty bloody marvelous. We're getting onto the stuff I really like now. So my wife makes all kinds of stuff with the wax, which is fun and artistic and makes the house smell good, and I like that. But most importantly, you can make booze with honey. You can make lots of booze with honey. Mead, alcohol, wine, and it's fabulous. I've been making this the last few years, and I've got to tell you, I've made some brews that are so disgusting you wouldn't want to wash your car with it. But some of them are good. I'm not saying I'm very good at making mead. Some of them are okay. The vast majority of them are terrible. But some of them are bloody good, and it's free. Well, it's not free. You're going to make the honey, I suppose. Here's some I made up with fruit. None of these were good, but they look pretty, so that's at least part of the puzzle. Don't forget about swarm prevention. So of the 2 colonies I lost this year, one of them was an overwintering nucleus colony, and they must have died out early in the winter. I went through that colony this afternoon, and they were in the bottom box, and they had a fairly sizable cluster with queen cells. So I think that they became queenless relatively early in the winter because they still had 8 frames of honey above them. This was a swarm that I caught. And, you know, this was late September. This is the other colony that didn't make it. So remember I said, if you wait till September to treat your bees, you've waited too long. They've already raised winter bees, or they're already in that process of raising winter bees. The pollen's starting to decline and they're raising winter bees. And this colony of bees that I caught was not from my own yard. All of my queens are marked, and this queen was not marked. And this colony didn't survive winter. And I suspect probably because of the mites, just the way we talked about earlier. All right, September, busy making winter bees. If you haven't got your mites under control, you better start looking for some new nukes for the next year, because your bees are probably not going to make it. Although I saw on Randy Oliver's website, he talked about the average time for a hive to succumb to mites is typically 2 years. So it's in the second year that they die off over winter. But nonetheless, if it gets to September and you haven't treated your bees, start seeing being theory. I told you at the beginning I like experimenting. I've got a theory that you could keep a swarm going as long as they're treated for mites. Uh-oh, my connection is unstable again. I think that you may be able to keep bees alive over the top of a Snellgrove board, over the top of a big colony. I don't know if it's possible. I'm going to give it a go. All your supers need to be stored, and you need to protect them from wax moths. And there's 2 ways to do that, really. Paramoth, which is kind of a harsh-smelling, disgusting chemical, or BT, which is a bacterium that kills wax moth larvae and eggs. And you can get it in a product called Zentari. It comes in a bag about yay big for about $30, and you mix a little bit in water and spray it on the frames. It's harmless to the bees, but it kills wax moths. But anyway, you want to store the frames so they don't get destroyed. Any light hives in my yard in September start getting 2-to-1 syrup, and they might get 4 or 5 gallons of 2-to-1 syrup if they're not heavy enough. They get pollen some if they need it. I get the mouse guards on early September, and I remove all the queen excluders. I forgot that one year, and one of my hives died because the queen was stuck below the excluder. What an idiot. October, put all your equipment away that I have, that I've been using that's no longer in use. Wash all my extraction equipment, get out of the way. Keep pounding all the light hives with 2-to-1 syrup. And this is the time to be ruthless. Any queen that is not up to snuff now is gone. Don't waste your time and money taking them through winter. It's too much bloody work. It's too much work and too much expense to take bees through winter that have no chance. You're far better off to lose 1 bee, which is the queen, and combine all of the rest with another colony and let them have a chance. All right, November. It's now too cold for syrup. If your hives aren't loaded by now, that's all she wrote, really. You're going to be supplemental feeding all winter, and that will not allow you to tell which of your queens is frugal over winter. Remember, we're selecting queens all year. So you want your quilt boxes on, your feeding shims on, foam insulation under the outer cover. If you can be bothered wrapping, go ahead and do it. If you can't be bothered, don't worry about it. Make sure no queen excluders are on. Early December, treat with oxalic acid 1 time. You're looking for a good high mite kill while they're relatively broodless. If it's not cold enough, you might have to wait till late December. You just have to judge it by the winter. By now, Margie's making all kinds of nice stuff in the house, and my house smells lovely of butter and soap and all kinds of stuff that she makes with the beeswax. January, check and feed. Start to plan the following year. Look at, see what went wrong, what I enjoyed about the season, what I didn't, what I thought I could have done better. There's always mistakes that I make. You know, all of us have a plan, and then it gets deviated and you make errors along the way, and I'm the same. So I try and address those things in the winter and think, what could I have done differently, and how do I do that better this next time round? And then repairing equipment, painting equipment, you know, fixing frames and whatnot. February, checking and feeding again, ordering any new gear you want, getting your Nucleus Colonies ordered if you need to buy new ones. The vast majority of Nucleus Colonies sell out very, very early. So if you want a particular Beekeepers nukes, you probably have to get onto them fairly early. And then March, we're all set to go again. So that's basically beekeeping for a year for me, as fast as I can go through it in an hour. Any questions?